The morning started like any other. She was running late, half-dressed, flitting from room to room in a blur of perfume and jangling earrings. Her voice carried through the house, sharp but not angry. "Have you seen my phone charger?" she called from the bedroom. "It was on the nightstand last night. I swear I left it there." I was in the kitchen, pouring a second cup of coffee, the ceramic mug warm against my palm. "Check the living room," I called back, trying not to sound irritated. This was her routine, perpetual chaos before any appointment. She could never find her keys, her phone, her charger. I was used to it, even if it sometimes wore on me. I took a sip of the coffee, leaned against the counter, and listened as she rummaged through her things. Her purse was already on the kitchen counter, half open. I could see the tangled mess inside: lip balm, a small bottle of hand sanitizer, a few crumpled receipts sticking out like folded wings. I knew her keys were in there. They always were, even if she insisted otherwise. "Did you check your bag?" I called out. "The keys are probably in there." She appeared in the doorway, one earring in place, the other dangling from her hand. "I don't think so," she said. "Can you just grab them for me?" I set the mug down and walked over. The purse was heavy, heavier than it looked, the leather straps worn smooth from years of use. I reached in, my fingers brushing against a mess of coins and loose pens, until I felt the familiar metal shape of her keys. But as I pulled them free, something else caught my attention. It was just a flicker of silver at first, half hidden beneath a crumpled receipt. I wouldn't have noticed it if it hadn't been for the way the light hit it, catching the thin band and the small cluster of stones. For a moment, I thought it might be a spare set of keys, or maybe a piece of costume jewelry. But then I recognized it. Her wedding ring. I froze, the keys dangling from my other hand. The coffee still lingered on my tongue, but suddenly I felt like I couldn't swallow. I looked at the ring, sitting there quietly at the bottom of her purse, as if it had been tossed in without a second thought. It didn't belong there. She wore it every day. I'd never seen her take it off, not for work, not for errands, not for anything. And now here it was, buried under old receipts and stray coins. "Everything okay?" she asked, breaking me out of my daze. I glanced up at her, standing in the doorway. She looked rushed but calm, not at all like someone who would toss her wedding ring in her bag and forget about it. I tried to think of something to say, but all I could do was nod. "Yeah," I managed. "Just, your keys were tangled up." "Thanks," she said, stepping forward and taking them from my hand. "I'm running late. I'll see you later, okay?" She leaned in and kissed my cheek, her perfume light and familiar. And just like that, she was gone, the sound of her shoes on the driveway fading as she drove away. I stood there for a moment, the ring still sitting in her purse, glaring at me. I should have said something. I should have asked her why it wasn't on her hand. But the words wouldn't come. It felt too surreal, too heavy to bring up in the middle of a rushed morning. Instead, I slowly reached back into her bag, pulled out the ring, and held it in my palm. It felt warm against my skin, though that was impossible. I turned it over, letting the light catch on the stones. There were no scratches, no scuffs, no sign that it had been dropped or damaged. It looked as perfect as the day I'd slid it onto her finger. But the fact that it was here, forgotten and out of place, made my chest tighten. Why wasn't she wearing it? Why hadn't she mentioned taking it off? I placed the ring on the counter, sitting it gently next to the sugar jar. Maybe she had a reason. Maybe it was something simple, something innocent. But no matter how many times I told myself that, the same question kept clawing at my mind. Who had she taken it off for? The day dragged on, each hour seeming longer than the last. I tried to go about my usual routine, work, emails, a quick run around the neighborhood, but my mind kept circling back to that ring. Every time I pictured it sitting at the bottom of her purse, the uneasy knot in my chest tightened a little more. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation, one that didn't involve the worst-case scenario my brain kept suggesting. But no matter how much I tried to reason it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time she got home, I had been stewing in my own thoughts for hours. She came through the door carrying groceries, her usual energy in full swing as she told me about the sale she found on avocados and how the line at the store had been ridiculous. She didn't seem tense or guilty, she seemed normal. It made me doubt myself, wonder if maybe I was overthinking it. But then I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Her finger was bare. The ring still wasn't there. I watched her as she moved around the kitchen, unloading bags and chatting about her day. She waved her hands as she spoke, as animated as ever, but the absence of that small band of gold was glaring. My heart pounded, and I could feel the words rising in my throat, demanding to be spoken. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Where's your ring?" She paused for just a second, her hand halfway to the fridge, before glancing down at her finger. "Oh," she said, her voice light. "I took it off yesterday. I guess I forgot to put it back on." She turned back to unpacking the groceries, her movements as smooth as ever, but that tiny pause in her response didn't go unnoticed. It wasn't much, just a fraction of a second. But it was enough to set my nerves on edge. I waited for her to say more, to offer an explanation that would make it all make sense. But she didn't. She just kept unpacking, humming quietly to herself. "Why'd you take it off?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression calm. "I was washing dishes. I don't like wearing it when I'm doing stuff like that." It was an answer. A simple, reasonable answer. And yet, I couldn't help but think about how it had been in her purse, not on the counter or the nightstand where she usually left it. It didn't add up, and the doubt in my mind only grew stronger. I nodded slowly, not wanting to push her too hard. "Makes sense," I said, even though it didn't. "But it's been off all day?" She turned around fully then, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I guess I just forgot. Is something wrong?" Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something. Confusion, maybe. Or was it guilt? I couldn't tell. But her voice was steady, her expression relaxed. If she was lying, she was doing a good job of hiding it. "No," I said quickly. "Just wondering." She nodded and went back to unpacking, leaving me standing there, my thoughts spinning. I didn't want to accuse her of anything without proof. Maybe she really had just forgotten to put it back on. Maybe I was reading too much into a small detail. But the image of that ring, tucked away at the bottom of her purse, wouldn't leave me alone. It felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't have all the pieces for. And until I did, I wasn't sure I could let it go. As the week wore on, the atmosphere between us shifted. It wasn't a sharp change, no fights, no shouting, but rather a quiet, creeping distance that settled into the spaces where conversation used to flow easily. She acted the same on the surface, cooking dinner, asking about my day, texting me pictures of random things that made her laugh. But every now and then, when she thought I wasn't looking, I caught a shadow of something in her expression. Guilt? Sadness? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that it was there, faint but undeniable. The ring was back on her finger now, the familiar band catching the light as she stirred her coffee or typed on her laptop. It should have reassured me, but it didn't. I couldn't shake the image of it buried in her purse, forgotten or hidden, whichever it was. Every time I saw it, the same question popped into my mind. Why had she taken it off in the first place? I told myself to let it go, to stop overthinking. People take off their rings all the time, right? Washing dishes, doing chores, running errands. It's normal. Except it wasn't normal for her. She'd never been the type to take it off for every little task. In fact, she used to joke about how it felt weird not to have it on, how she'd panic if she couldn't feel it on her finger. That's what made this different. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It felt like the start of something I couldn't see clearly yet. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a show we'd both been following, I decided to bring it up again. I waited until a commercial break, then turned to her and tried to sound casual. "Hey, can I ask you something?" She looked at me, her face open and curious. "Sure, what's up?" I hesitated. "About the ring. I know you said you took it off to do dishes, but it ended up in your purse. How did that happen?" Her expression shifted, just for a moment. A brief flash of surprise, followed by something more guarded. "I guess I just threw it in there," she said lightly. "You know how I am, always shoving stuff into my bag without thinking." Her answer was plausible, but it felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for the question. I nodded slowly, trying not to press too hard. "I just thought it was unusual, that's all. You're usually so careful with it." She shrugged, her tone still light. "Yeah, I know. I guess I was just distracted that day." I dropped it after that, not wanting to push her too far. But the unease didn't go away. If anything, it grew. I started noticing little things, how she'd keep her phone close, how she'd quickly swipe away a notification when I walked by. Nothing overt, nothing I could point to as evidence of anything. But once the seed of doubt was planted, it didn't take much to make it grow. The ring stayed on her finger after that, but it didn't feel the same. It was like a prop now, something she put on for appearances. Maybe it was all in my head, a story I was creating out of scraps and shadows. But every time I thought I might be overreacting, I remembered that moment, finding it in her purse, cold and hidden. And I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had to figure out what was really going on. The tension lingered, a faint hum that undercut everything we did together. She still smiled, still laughed at my jokes, still leaned her head on my shoulder while we watched movies, but something was missing. The easy, unspoken understanding we used to have had shifted. Now, every word felt deliberate, every silence more pronounced. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I decided I couldn't keep the questions bottled up anymore. I watched her stir her pasta absently, her gaze unfocused, and took a deep breath. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She looked up, her fork pausing midair. "Sure." I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I've been thinking about that day when I found your ring in your purse. You said you were distracted, that you just threw it in there. But I can't help wondering why it was off at all. I mean, you don't usually take it off unless you're cleaning or—" "I already told you," she interrupted, her tone sharper than I expected. "I don't know why it ended up in my purse. I just wasn't thinking." Her reaction caught me off guard. "I'm not accusing you of anything," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just want to understand." She set her fork down and leaned back in her chair. "What's there to understand?" she said, her voice rising. "You're making it into something it's not." "I'm not making it into anything," I said. "I'm just asking because it felt strange. It's not like you to forget something like that. I want to know what was going on in your head that day." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something more. But then she shook her head and stood up, taking her plate to the sink. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, her back turned. "I already told you everything. Why can't you just let it go?" Her words stung. She wasn't yelling, but the frustration in her tone was unmistakable. I watched her rinse her plate, the sound of running water filling the silence between us. My chest felt tight, and I knew if I pushed any harder, it might break something that we couldn't fix. "I don't mean to upset you," I said quietly. I don't want there to be anything unsaid between us." She turned off the faucet and leaned on the counter, her shoulders slumping. "There's nothing unsaid," she said softly. "You're reading too much into it." I wanted to believe her, but the wall she'd put up made it impossible. We stayed like that for a while, the room heavy with unspoken tension. She didn't turn around, and I didn't press further. Instead, I stood up, cleared my plate, and left the kitchen. In the quiet of the living room, I sat on the couch and stared at the dark TV screen. I didn't know what to do. She insisted there was nothing more to the story, but her defensiveness only deepened my doubts. I wanted to trust her, to take her at her word, but every fiber of my being told me there was more to it than she was willing to admit. I stayed there for a long time, my thoughts looping endlessly. By the time I finally went to bed, she was already asleep, her back turned to me. I slid under the covers, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of all the things we weren't saying pressing down on me. The next day, I avoided the topic altogether. I thought maybe if I gave it some time, if I stopped bringing it up, the tension might ease. We spent the morning at home, doing our usual Saturday routines. She watered the plants on the balcony, while I cleaned up the living room. There were moments that felt almost normal, when she leaned over the railing, calling out about a new flower bud, or when she laughed as I struggled to fix the wonky coffee table leg. For a few hours, it felt like we were finding our footing again. But the questions never left my mind. They lurked in the background, waiting for a quiet moment to surface. By the time afternoon rolled around, the weight of them was back, heavier than ever. I couldn't keep it in any longer. She was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a recipe book. The sunlight streamed through the window, making her hair shine. It looked so ordinary, so peaceful, and yet I could feel the crack running through it all. I sat down across from her, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Can we talk?" I said. She looked up, her eyes wary but not unkind. "What about?" I need to know if there's something you're not telling me," I said. "About the ring, about that day. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to it." She set the book down, her fingers resting lightly on the pages. "I don't know how many times I can say this," she said, her voice even but tired. "There's nothing else. I made a mistake. I forgot about it. That's all." "Then why does it feel like you're hiding something?" I asked. "You're so defensive about it." "I just want the truth." Her jaw tightened, and she looked down at the table for a long moment. "Because I'm frustrated," she said finally. "I've told you everything I can. I don't know what else you want from me. It feels like no matter what I say, You won't believe me. Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge of sadness to it. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of deception. But all I saw was exhaustion, an emotional weariness that mirrored my own. I want to believe you, I said. I really do. But it's hard when things don't add up. I need to feel like we're on the same page. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted. I'm trying, but you keep questioning me, and it feels like you don't trust me anymore. I felt the sting of her words, the truth in them. She was right, I didn't trust her, at least not fully. And that realization hit me harder than anything she could have said. What was the point of asking her over and over if I was never going to take her at her word? Maybe the problem wasn't just her explanation. Maybe it was my inability to let it go. I'm sorry, I said after a long pause. I know I've been pushing too hard. It's just hard for me. I want us to be okay again. Her expression softened, and she reached across the table, her fingers brushing against mine. I want that too, she said. But you have to trust me. I'm not hiding anything. I promise. I nodded, even though I still wasn't sure if I believed her. I wanted to, and maybe that was enough for now. We sat there in silence, our hands resting together on the table. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step forward, a small crack in the wall between us. And maybe, just maybe, it was a start.